Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event on racialization and racism in the Middle East and its diasporas. I'm very happy to welcome you. My name is Nadje Ali, and I'm director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Browne, and where I'm also professor of anthropology and Middle East studies. So the event today is the first in a new series that I'm co-hosting jointly with Professor Beshara Doumani, whom I will be introducing in a minute. And so this series is aiming to explore the intersections, the intersectional struggles of anti-Black racism and forms of racialization in the Middle East and also its diasporas. This is, of course, a long overdue initiative, and I mean, many of us have been thinking about it, but it is, of course, true that we were particularly inspired and moved by the events of the summer and our solidarity with Black Lives Matter movement in this country. And I guess many of us felt uncomfortable that, while it's more easily to express solidarity, with a signature, it's more difficult to address racism and racialization close to home. And of course, in the Middle East and its diasporas, we have a long history of unexplored slavery, well, unexplored except for a few voices. And I'm so happy that we're actually welcoming Professor Troutt Powell today, who's one of the pioneers of few scholars who have worked historically on slavery. And then there's, of course, now a new generation of scholars. And so I'm glad that we have invited two of them. But today's event is really just the beginning. It's looking at historical perspectives. And I should say that in the context of my own work on feminist activism in the Middle East, I have detected a shift. So the new generation of feminist activists is much more intersectional in their approach. And the issue of racism, racialization has been at the forefront of struggles. I mean, particularly when I think about Egypt, where Nubian and Sudanese feminists have been involved in contemporary feminist struggles. Or I'm thinking of queer feminists in Lebanon, whose feminist and queer struggle has been very much linked to the plight and the struggle of female domestic workers. And of course, there is a strong element of racism and racialization in that struggle. Okay, but let me now introduce the speakers. So as I said, I'm very excited that we were able to invite Professor Troutt Powell, who is, as I said, a pioneer. She is the Christopher H. Browne Distinguished Professor of History and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of Tell This in My Memory, Stories of Enslavement from Egypt, Sudan, and the Ottoman Empire, as well as A Different Shade of Colonialism, Egypt, Great Britain, and the Mastery of Sudan, as well as being a co-author with John Hunwick of The African Diaspora in the Mediterranean Lands of Islam. Eve has received multiple fellowships, amongst them from the American Research Center in Egypt and the Social Science Research Council. She has been a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. In 2003, she was named a MacArthur Foundation Fellow, and in the spring of 2020, she became a new member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Eve, I would like to welcome you. Another guest is Bam Willoughby, who is interested in Black historiographies of Ottoman and post-Ottoman worlds, proletarianization of Africans and the Ottoman Empire, geographies of African-descended populations in contemporary Turkey, climatology, and morphology. Ban is interested in how community relationships to agricultural labor tell time, relationships between so-called Middle Easterners and so-called Western scientific discourse, indigenous epistemologies, and also how we can use this knowledge to challenge prevailing notions of Blackness and the ways in which we might theorize what the terms Black bios. Their current research project investigates how the manumission of enslaved Africans in Northern Africa at the end of the 19th century and their subsequent relocation into southwestern Anatolia for the express purpose of land cultivation, always in the context of their freedom, served as a driver for Black identity formation in contemporary Turkey and provides a scaffolding for contextualizing the kinds of conditions that have made Black Aegean rural living, livelihood, and survival possible in contemporary Turkey. Welcome, Bam. Our third guest is Razan Idris. Razan is a Sudanese American PhD student in history. Razan is at the University of Pennsylvania. She studies histories of Blackness in Afro-Arab communities in the African continent and in the diaspora. For her current project, Razan has been exploring Black identity at the Religious Institute of Al-Azhar in Egypt in the 19th and 20th centuries. Razan is also the curator of the online Sudan Syllabus Open project, collecting English language resources on Sudanese social, cultural, and intellectual history. Now, co-organizer of this broader initiative, as I said before, is my colleague, Professor Beshara Doumani. He is professor of history and the inaugural holder of the Mahmoud Darwish Professorship of Palestinian Studies at Browne University. His research focuses on peoples, places, and time periods erased or marginalized by mainstream scholarship on the early modern and modern Middle East. Beshara has been playing a very important role in building Middle East studies at Browne. Thanks for joining us today, Beshara.
Yep.
And then finally, I'm really pleased that we also managed to invite Professor Sherene Seikaly, who's actually going to moderate the event today. Sherene is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's the author of Man of Capital, Scarcity, and Economy in Mandate Palestine. She is following the trajectory of her great-grandfather in her forthcoming book titled From Baltimore to Beirut on the Question of Palestine. His trajectory from 19th century mobility across Baltimore and Sudan to 20th century mobility in Lebanon places the question of Palestine in a global history of race, capital, slavery, and dispossession. She is co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies, senior editor of Arab Studies Journal, and co-editor of Jadaliyya. Welcome, Sherene. And now over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nadje and Beshara, for organizing this event. It's really exciting to be in one of many conversations on race, racialization, Blackness, and anti-Blackness in the Middle East. These include recent panels at NYU, UPenn, MESA, the Middle East Librarian Association's Social Justice Series, as well as the Middle East Studies Association meeting, and importantly, a series of MISNA webinars that are in Arabic, Farsi, and English on anti-Black racism in Southwest Asia and North Africa and their diasporas. Such conversations and the work of scholars over many decades, as well as the folks, including the folks who have joined us today, pose urgent political and epistemological demands to shift how we study, think, and teach the Middle East. These invitations allow us to think of the Middle East as a place not to implement, but produce theory and envision different futures. As Katie Hickerson asked in a recent MESA, Middle East Studies Association roundtable, how would the centering of race and Blackness change our understandings of the modern Middle East? The ethnicization of religion, the rise of nation states, and the questions of race and racialization, I think, are part of what would shift and would allow us to put Blackness and anti-Blackness in conversation with Armenian, Amazigh, Kurdish, Palestinian, and Jewish questions, and the dynamic formations and shifts of a global color line. In the most immediate and urgent sense, such moves demand from us to change how and what we look at when we are studying the Middle East. As the Ethiopian organizer Benchi Yimir put it in a recent MESA panel on catastrophe in Lebanon. We cannot understand this current moment without studying and confronting kafala as a form of enslavement. And that's just one sort of demand of many. I'll say before I turn to the event that my pronouns are she, her, and that the structure of the event today basically is going to begin with me posing a general question, and then Nadje and Beshara will also weigh in. At that point, we will turn to our attendants, who are already 115 people, who will get a chance to pose questions in the Q&A box. So let's start off. I'd like to ask Bam, Razan, and Eve to begin by talking to us about racialization and racism in your work, both in terms of content and method.
I'll go ahead and get started on this question first. Thank you so much for this question. When I think about, so I work specifically, as was stated in my introduction, in the context of Turkey. And I first began working in Turkey, well, before I say that, I'll say immediately for me as an academic, as a junior scholar in my 6th year, I think about what is my relationship to being an intellectual and what is my relationship to being an academic. What are my commitments as an intellectual in this kind of Gramscian sense, but also in the kinds of questions that I ask myself in my work, and then what is the work that I do as an academic, and what does that look like for me? And as a Black person who works in the Middle East, it is really hard for me to make that separation very, very cut and dry, because my life and myself, my body as an intellectual, as a person, as a human who's living in my world, is interacting with my world and generating questions and conclusions that are impossible to separate from the work that I do, and especially as they are part of my own journey in my research and as a graduate student. For me, as an American from the United States who also has a very specific relationship to racialization, as a Black American in the United States, it's really important for me to constantly remember the ways that racialization operates for me as someone who traverses space, and as such traverses historical contexts of what we can call racialization, if we kind of echo where we hear this kind of discourse being created in the Americas, and in the as an American, and in this Middle Eastern context. So for me, racialization shows up as an attempt to think about power and how power operates, and what I notice about and what I read, and what my research has shown me about how state power operates, how identitarian how formation of identity through an identitarian framework manages, and power dislocates, disempowers in certain ways. So I try and think about, in my research, racialization and racism operate both as method, because myself, my body, in a Fanonian context, to think about where Fanon says, "Oh, my body make me a man who questions." It is in Black Skin, White Masks. I take that, and it's impossible for me as someone who is living in the world and doing my research in the world, or not just impossible, it's necessary for me, and it becomes incumbent upon me as the researcher who is Black in a certain context to interact with how my Black body emerges in a new space, and requires me to ask new questions of myself and of my relationship to being a self in a space. And so for me, my racialization emerges as both the method and the content, because it provides the the vehicle to have the perception to have asked these questions as an American visiting space, a new space, and being interacted with in a way that was different than I had been familiar with, as well as someone who then took that a step further and then turned that into research, into dissertation work, who's looking at archival documents in different archives, who take seriously how these kinds of questions of origin, or how origin becomes kind of category over time, what that looks like within my like to develop that model within my work, as it hasn't really been in the greatest existence or overabundance in my work, in my region, really. So that's how racialization and racism really show up for me in my work.
Thank you. Go ahead, Razan.
Thank you so much, Browne, for having shared that with us. I'm sitting here thinking, what can I possibly say after that? And again, thank you so much for everyone for having invited me to be part of this conversation today. I'd say that for me, the ways in which race and racialization show up for me as in methodology and as content. So the ways in which my work has moved towards where it is today, which is looking at Black identity at Al-Azhar in Egypt, has been an exploration of the ways in which race is used to explain Blackness in the Middle East. And that's something that I've been concerned with as someone who was raised in Sudan, as someone who was raised biracial and was trying to navigate what it meant to be Black within Sudan and what it meant to be Black in the United States, and how this language of Blackness and of race was being used and utilized in different ways across oceans, and the ways in which, and so, you know, as I moved to academic spaces to try and find answers for what was going on around me, for understanding colorist slurs in Sudan, for understanding legacies of enslavement, for understanding legacies of anti-Blackness in the US as well, I was trying to understand, how do these things make sense? How do they fit together? What are their genealogies? And so what that led me to is trying to explore, where do different terms that we now experience as race in the Middle East come from? Where exactly are these colorist ideas coming from? How are they coming together with ideas about genealogy or paternal lineage? How are those coming together with ideas about enslavement? How are all of those three things being transformed over time? And how does that help us explain anti-Blackness in the region today? Because often what I find in conversations about Blackness in the Middle East is that there's a lot of, I would say occasionally I run into a lot of obfuscation based on language, based on people saying, well, it's not the same thing as what we assume an Anglo-American definition of race is, and therefore that doesn't apply here. Or, oh, well, this term means one thing in Egypt and it means another in Sudan, so it can't be colorist or racist because it's being deployed in different ways in different places. And so for me, the ways, my interest, or what I want to do with race in my work as a methodology is to look at the transformations of race and the layering of race in the Middle East. And to say that just because things have changed over time does not mean that they are not racist. It is just a layering that has happened over time, and that we are all smart enough and historicized enough to be able to look at how that has changed over time and to negotiate what it means at different times and what it means in different places, as opposed to just an outright, yes, it's there, no, it's not there. As for how that emerges in terms of my actual work as content in my study of Al-Azhar, the way in which it emerges is to say that we can find a lot about Black people at Al-Azhar that previously I think people have not wanted to find or to look at. And by that, I mean, we can both push to find African students at Al-Azhar in the 19th and 20th centuries who have often not been studied or looked at or been taken for granted as not there. But then we can also push to understand how these students at Al-Azhar negotiated the language around Blackness that we see from sources in Egypt at the time, both in the legal books published by their colleagues at Al-Azhar, who had plenty to say about Blackness, and also how they navigated being Black men at a time period where these texts were saying all kinds of stuff about Blackness. And not only that, what these men themselves thought about Blackness in their own communities, whether they were in Sudan, in Somalia, in Chad, etc. These men left lots of sources for us to work with. And so by pushing the ways, I think, in which racism encourages us to not see, I think that maybe we can talk about race as seeing, and race as a methodology as seeing what we have been previously told to not look for or to only see in particular ways.
Thank you so much. Eve?
I'm going to share. I'm going to share my screen in a minute. I just want to introduce what I'm going to say by actually. This is the first time in a multiplicity of webinars, which I'm very happy about, and very, very happy to be invited to this one, in which we have been discussing in different ways Blackness and anti-Blackness in the Middle East. And I wanted to talk today about, I'm going back to something that was brought up to me when I was a graduate student that I have been wrestling with for a long time, which is about where does the racism come from in the Middle East? And one of the answers to that question that I often heard was that it came from Europe. And that in places like Syria and Lebanon, it came from France, and in places where the British had their mandate or the British were deeply involved, as in Egypt, it came from Britain. And I have accepted part of that for a long time because we know there was a great deal of racism in the French Empire and the British Empire, and its legacy states to this day. But I'm now working on a project of the visual culture of slavery in the Middle East. And one of the chapters that I've been wrestling with for a long time is actually looking at a particular French painter, Jean-Léon Gérôme, and his sort of trade in Black models and in the images of Blackness in the late 19th century. But I'm not going to talk about Gérôme today. I just want to show two contrasting pictures by the same French painter to discuss images of Blackness and then how that relates to the Middle East. So I'll share my screen right now. And I have a 2-slide slideshow. Okay, so this is a portrait of a Haitian revolutionary, a former slave named Jean-Baptiste Belly, who actually had come from Senegal, or what is now Senegal, was sold in slavery to the colony of Saint-Domingue in the French colony, and he bought his own freedom in 1764, and during the French Revolution, particularly during the Directoire period, he went to Paris as a representative of the colonies. And this is a portrait of him that was painted before 1897 by Anne-Louis Giraudet. And here is Belly, who was also a fierce ally of Toussaint Louverture in Saint-Domingue during the Haitian Revolution. And the Haitian Revolution, of course, took place basically during the time of the French Revolution. One started in 1789, the other started in 1791. And so this is a picture by Giraudet that certainly gives a certain dignity, a certain racial dignity to Belly, and puts him against the Abbé Raynal, who was a very eloquent and productive abolitionist in this period of the late 18th century in France. So, now there has been a lot written about this painting, especially sort of the over-sexualized way, some could read into Belly's outfit, but his his being at home yet distant, being one of us yet distant, is a major theme in how this painting, what it has meant to different generations of salon goers in France. And I want to contrast this painting with this painting by the same painter, Giraudet, who this painting was commissioned by Napoleon after the French invasion of Egypt in 1798. So basically 1 year after Belli, or 2 years after Belli gets this fantastic portrait, the French go into Egypt, and we think we know a lot about what the French did in Egypt, but I wanted to point out one thing here. So here is he's known as the Blonde Hussar, and he's going in to punish the Nubian who is just beheaded. I'm sorry, or is about to kill. Let's see, where's the head? This is the beheading right down here. And here are Nubians fighting with the Mamluks in this picture. And what is this is a picture of whitewash, of whiteface, not so much of blackface. The person who this is really supposed to represent is let me sure I get his name right, is General Thomas Alexandre Dumas, the father of Dumas the father. So Dumas grand-père, Dumas the grandfather, okay, who was a Haitian-born mulatto, as the terms go in those days, and rose up, as many did, in the French army. And as many might not know, I certainly didn't before beginning this chapter, fought with French. Dumas was a leader, a general, with Napoleon invading Egypt, and he was put at the forefront of the forces because it was considered he looked like Nubians and he looked like Egyptians, and he was known for his beauty and his strength, and he did what he was told and he went in. But after soon during the invasion of Egypt, he began to cross Napoleon, and he was sent home in disgrace, and actually died in disgrace. And so his picture was changed, and Giraudet was commissioned to put in a white officer instead of a black officer. Now, much can be said about, French racism against Egyptians and others in Africa and the Middle East, but I don't know if much has been discussed about how intertwined Black skin was at this time, and how even a representative of Nubians at this time, in the early 19th century, could also represent, and I'm working on the history of this painting, the fact that there were slave traders selling Sudanese and Nubian slaves, mostly Nubian slaves at this period, into the French army. And many of these people returned with the French army to France, where they became models for all kinds of Blackness throughout the Middle East. And it was Jean-Léon Gérôme, I'm going to stop sharing right now. It was Jean-Léon Gérôme who also really capitalized on the use of these models' bodies and on the trade in images of slavery. So I'll stop there. It's a whole new turn for my work, and I'm taking on Orientalism in a way I never thought I was going to, and open it up for other questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Beshara.
Thank you. I would like to build on the question of layering that Razan introduced, embodiment that Bam talked about, and of course, the importance of historical context that I think we saw very nicely with Eve. And that has to do with the relationship between notions of difference that are pre-colonial and notions of difference that are a consequence of the colonial encounter and what happens afterwards. Many would argue that the colonial encounter was a rupture that introduced a new conceptual vocabulary outside of which we really cannot think or express. So whatever we do, we're really entrapped within that colonial paradox. But as a historian, it's difficult for me to accept this. And I think there are all sorts of residues in even entire landscapes of meaning that can be traced to the pre-colonial period, which should still shape our perspectives. So the question for all of you is, how do we deal with this issue of layering between the pre-colonial and the post-colonial in terms of the meanings of the words that we use in order to do our academic work? And I would like to complicate it even more than just the question of Blackness in the Middle East or anti-Blackness in the Middle East. And by just sharing a little story about my graduate seminar now, which has people from Mexico, from Brazil, from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all over the world, really. And they're all committed to justice-centered kind of research and gay scholarship, but they're having a hard time thinking about the relationship between sectarianism, ethnicity, race, and caste. And because they come from different historiographical traditions, and these words have acquired all sorts of meanings that seem to be pointing towards the same kinds of things, but maybe not. So it's an open-ended question. I think you can take it anywhere, in any direction you want to, but I'm just wondering, what challenges are you facing in terms of thinking about the pre-colonial notions of difference compared to the kind of language that seems to be legible in scholarship today?
You got that? Okay.
Oh, Eve, did you want to go for, we were going to do, I can't hear you, but I think from your body language, you're saying let Bam speak.
Oh, okay. But, okay, so yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's such a great question. I want to lead with what what Razan shared earlier of using race as a way or attempting to use race as ways of seeing. So I want to start with that as I attempt to answer your question, because I think a huge issue and that is that a lot of us who are working on Blackness and anti-Blackness and racial formation in the Middle East are facing is, especially as if we are Americans, and most of us are, if we are, is that there's such a difficulty of navigating the nuances of language. I mean, even when you say the pre-colonial and post-colonial, I wonder exactly what you mean, and if we're going to say colonial specifically to talk about Turkey or the Ottoman Empire, I mean that those discontents have been written out, and we haven't answered it. Is the Ottoman Empire the same kind of empire, say, as the British colonial empire or any other empire? I mean, it's not certain, and so to think about the nuance in language and how to use these kinds of terms, I think it's that's the difficulty of epistemic rupture. It's the difficulty of existing as a person in a very specific ontological position, research position, and attempting to ask these very specific kinds of pointed questions in different geographical, social, spatial, historical senses. So I think it's such a brilliant question. I think that's what's really cool also and interesting about this new generation of scholars who are working in the Middle East, is that because we have such challenging relationships to race and to thinking about the history of race, that the perspective is actually really the rupture. There's so much texture there in ways that are not possible outside of this context, but that are differently possible in other contexts. Yes. So for example, I must confront sectarianism, I must confront nation state formation, I must confront revolution, I must confront identitarianism in really specific ways as I understand them as they relate to the Ottoman Empire and post-Ottoman Empire territories. I must, but I also recognize the limits of language. I mean, if there is a way that power operated in one geography that cannot extend to another geography, then perhaps it's worth thinking about the utility of the language itself, or the utility of the term, which is what I grapple with. I mean, when I first kind of found myself in this space of being a Black person studying Black things in not traditionally Black spaces, I had a lot of trouble with this language, right? I felt like challenged by the language. I mean, what do I call myself something, other people are calling me something, whatever that means, naming, it's naming. So I think it's very challenging. And what I try to do is think about that kind of friction as pointing to how to see the Middle East or Turkey, the modern Turkish nation state post 1924. I mean, I do try and be very specific, but I studied. I'm a student of comparative literature, of the kind of possibility that comes with thinking about the comparative. So it's impossible. It's really important for me in my work to also think about how the geographies outside of Turkey and the greater Ottoman Empire and I mean, particularly as it relates to the Middle East, how that own historical trajectory, because the kind of sectarianism or secularism that exists within the context of Turkey is so specific to the context of Turkey. It's so specific, and so I think that I think personally that these terms, because I guess the way that I'll say it is like, because I found them there already in Middle East studies. I mean, they were already there. This is language that has been used for decades. Like, we are very confident in talking about sectarianism. We're very confident in talking about the millet system. We're very confident in talking about the Ottoman Empire. These are words that were already there. And then I'm trying to name something that is not necessarily in high circulation, not necessarily not pointed at or not already said, but how do I talk about these things in this way at this time? And so I think I'm in constant, or not I think, I mean, I'm in constant negotiation of that dynamic of how to name. Do I call this anti-Blackness? Do I call this anti-Arabness? What's the word? Like, are we talking about Zenjis? Like, who are we talking about? What is it that we're talking about? Yeah.
Just very quickly, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you just used Arabness. So when I'm in Turkey and I say I'm an Arab, they say you're not Black.
Right. Exactly.
So Arab and Black are the same thing. Is this something that can be traced to a particular set of locations, events, histories, or is this something new?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That goes directly into the history. I mean, exactly what is also being done in our region and time period is the semantic, as I was also already raised, but this is a 19th century development that emerges in this 21st century context that we see linguistically, where there was no kind of distinction between who is Arab and what that meant, or what that person looked like, let's say. And so now the language in Turkey is still utilizing Arab to designate a particular kind of distance or a historical distance, while when Turkey was in its kind of formation of itself as Turk relative to this kind of outskirts of Arab and other. And so to now move into the 21st century context where Arab has been so solidified to mean other in such a broad sense that it both refers to Arab as Arab and Arab as African descended people that have like darker colored skin.
Thank you so much. Razan?
Yeah, I think when it comes to this question of the usefulness of the term race in the Middle East, I think there's two issues that are often at play for me. Firstly, I tend to ask what exactly is going on when we question the usefulness of using this term race. I think on one hand, there's a very interesting critique, which is similar to ones which happen on the use of of terms like patriarchy and gender when talking about pre-colonial societies where we might be flattening a lot of local dynamics through imposing new terms that are not the terms that people in those societies necessarily used. I think that's really interesting. I think that that points towards a really important question of having to center the terms that people themselves are using and talking, and I guess the politics of translating those terms and what terms we choose to use, and whether we should in fact be using, as Bam mentions, like should we be saying anti-Arabness? Should we be talking about, in my case, I tend to prefer to use anti-Blackness when speaking about Egypt to be able to sidestep some of these issues that come with talking about oh, is it race? Is it not race? So that's the first part. I think that's the interesting, I guess, like critique, which we should be able to walk with and able to think about when you're doing our work. On the other hand, I also think that for some, unfortunately, I think the questioning of the term race can often be a method of, again, to refer to what I said earlier, it can be a method of concealing rather than seeing. What I usually ask people is, okay, well, what happens when we stop using race? If I decide to, for example, stop saying, oh, I'm looking at race in Egypt in the 19th and 20th centuries, and instead I say, I'm looking at anti-Blackness, and I'm looking at all of the exact same terms used in Arabic, aswad, and who is being referred to as aswad, etc. What do I find? So I think that if we're talking about difficulties of using these terms race, that should be a beginning of a conversation rather than the end of the conversation, as it seems that in the public sphere it's often used as. It's often a conversation of, oh, well, it doesn't match this term race, therefore it's not worth looking at. It's not worth looking at what's going on underneath it. It's not worth talking about. And that's where I think it's useful to push back. Because what happens when we start looking at these terms and what happens in pre-colonial versus post-colonial society, you know, it's interesting, but it's, again, it should be a conversation that is had. Like, for example, say someone, let me use my example of Egypt. And because right now in my thesis, I'm trying explicitly to look at pre-colonial period, what's known as like the semi-colonial period and the post-colonial period, and looking at exactly what's going on in each one of those in terms of descriptions and words that are used to interrogate Black people. So you will be able to find some terms that are introduced within the 20th century that were previously not used, but become grafted onto terms that were used. So you'll go into 19th century Egyptian texts and you will very clearly find descriptions of who is white and who is Black, and those are grafted onto certain ethnicities. For example, in Egypt, you'll find Nubians often described as Black, as Suud, versus Mamluks being described as Bild or white. Then you'll move into the early 20th century, and we can have a really interesting conversation about how Egyptians start to use terms like tahsin al-nasl, or improving the race, which is not something that they would have, that I would find in the earlier texts, but becomes very easily grafted onto Egyptian ideas of Blackness as ugliness that needs to be gotten rid of through these new eugenic methods. So yeah, I think that I guess for me, when it comes to this question of, you know, the term race, I guess I'm always interested in where exactly the difficulty is, because if it's a difficulty of what it obscures, that's really interesting to me. If it's a difficulty of what people do not want to see, then that's a different story.
Thank you. Eve?
Well, I certainly agree with Bam and Razan and what they're saying. And I jumped to answer the question. Bam answered part of how I would have answered it, Beshara, which is, pre-colonial, who's colonial, and I was thinking about the Ottoman Empire as much as I was thinking about Egypt in the 19th century, and Egypt's, relationship with the Sudan, which it claimed as its own. And then I think too that, so I leave that pre-colonial, post-colonial. I haven't found that terribly useful for my own work, although I am finding it more and more useful now. But I've always thought that so much of the terminology when you come to the Middle East, as it does when you're looking in the West, has to do with what slavery did to people's eyes, and how enslavement. How slavery, the color of slavery, or the colors of slavery, were cast by whom and how, onto a broad spectrum of populations in the Middle East who looked to many as if they fit that word, and by that word, I mean Abid. By that word, I know there are many other vocabularies of race and color in terms of slavery throughout the Ottoman Empire, throughout the Middle East, in Iran, but I do think that this is a very important part. And when do you date that from? Is that pre-colonial? Is that post-colonial? I think that there's another way of exploring the chronologies of these words and these histories and their connotations. And then the last thing I would say about, what term is better, race or racism, which I stand by, and anti-Blackness is also, what kind of scholarships have we in Middle East studies been willing to listen to about this, and which ones have we not been willing to listen to? And if you are bringing a methodology of historiography from the Balkans, perhaps, or if you are exploring, in relationship to the Ottoman Empire, if you were exploring, other questions of caste, et cetera, do Marxist methodologies help more there? But one of the things that I would say within the field of Middle East studies that I've been in for a long time now is that that the study of Blackness within the United States has been almost considered, forbidden. It has almost been considered, if you will, haram, because there is often an expectation that those who are really reading, people like W.B. Du Bois, or looking at Frederick Douglass, or et cetera, or the many, many, many African Americans who went to the Middle East, who thought about issues in the Middle East, that if we look at that kind of work, or more contemporary work, we are imposing a US-centered idea of race onto a wide spectrum of things. But I'm not sure we've asked those same questions by looking at, we're all quoting Foucault all the time about power, and we're all quoting, all kinds of different kinds of fields, Gramsci, Marx, et cetera. And so I think one of the questions I would raise to your question, Beshara, is, what methodologies are we allowing to help us answer this question, and which methodologies have we not explored deeply enough?
Thank you all. If it's okay with you, Beshara, I'm going to turn to Nadje now.
Yeah, thank you all. So I'm interested to exploring a bit further the relationship between racialization, racism on the one hand, and gender and sexuality. I mean, we know that those are deeply gendered and sexualized processes and terms. So I guess for Bam particularly, I was very interested in an article that I read by you, in which you look at the realm of the virtual to analyze how Turks of African descent are being caricatured and marginalized. And also othered, and I think you were looking particularly at ads and also soap operas. So I would be interested to hear your reflections on the way that gender, sexuality, and racializations are apparent. Because I mean, one of the things that I found interesting as well is that the racist blackface characters also sometimes engage in gender transgression. So that link I found really interesting. And Razan, I understand that you're interested in exploring Blackness as defined and experienced by male students at Al-Azhar, and you've done that historically and also in contemporary context. So how do you think that contestations and constructions of masculinity are intertwined with constructions of Blackness? And you alluded to that in the beginning. So I'd like you to expand a bit on that. And then Eve, to you, I know that in your book, Tell This in My Memory, you provide these very moving, intimate accounts of experiences of both slave and slave owners. And can you tell us, how are these experiences gendered, and how was sexuality entangled in the construction of racial identities and attitudes towards slavery?
Thank you. Bam, I'll give you first dibs.
Sorry?
Would you like to?
Oh yeah, sorry. Yes.
No worries.
I'm sorry. Yes. Thank you so much. Yeah. Yeah. So the article that you're referring to, in the article you're referring to, I was really trying to, Nadje, I was really trying to think about these new methods that I have not seen critically explored in the context of the Middle East of attending to racialization and race. And I was trying to, I was really, I explored the way this figure called the Arab Badja, and also called Baji Kalfa in meaning house girl, and or something akin to what we might say is Negro girl or house girl. And I was exploring the depictions of the Arab Badja, the Baji Kalfa in Turkish popular television, and the way that on Turkish contemporary television, Turkish popular television, Arab Badja, Baji Kalfa, Dadi, also referred to as Dadi, she is always a so-called Black woman figure, but she's never played by a Black woman. She's always played by a man who's in blackface and in drag, which is just many kinds of aesthetic visual moves to make to depict a character. And so I was really interested in how this emerges on the kind of visual surface. Like, how is it circulated? How is this in a public kind of popular configuration and consumption to where it is recognizable and understood collectively? I was very interested in that, in something that to me is not perhaps so recognized, not to me, but how is it recognizable and understood collectively? And I found that the question of sexuality, sex, and race and gender all emerged in this kind of way because of how division of labor, what I understand in the history and what is demonstrated in the history, from the history, how division of labor is so tied to these processes of racialization in the context of the Middle East, how manumitting Africans, or even not even just in terms of enslavement, if we were to go further back in earlier centuries, 17th century, 18th century, but also being teachers in madrasas, or in how entering into the context of what is modern day Turkey through the framework of labor or work, or alienation of labor, let's say, through the context of slavery, provides a method for thinking about how certain bodies also, this is also thought of, another scholar also thinks of this not in terms, one scholar, Ezgi Chakmak, also thinks of this in terms of Circassian slaves who were in the Ottoman Empire as well, and how racialization also functions as through processes of division of labor in this context, which we've seen this in the Ottoman Empire. And so I was basically trying to think about that, about how this kind of division of labor, how there's a figure in a home, a manumitted or freed African in a home who exists historically, who is then drawn upon to act as a kind of lubricant or who operates within a visual context as the funny figure who always makes food available, who always is there to cook and clean, and just this kind of labor. There's this kind of labor relationship between this Black woman figure on television. And so whether or not I want to think about this new method to think about racialization, it's so apparent in how race, what I call race, what I use in terms of race, operates in a 19th century to a 19th century context, and then in a 21st century modern Turkish context. It's the historical event of proletarianization, of reinscribing African bodies into the cultural milieu, and what that process looked like, created. And not just, again, and that's what's really cool, I think, about Turkey, about the Ottoman Empire, is that it's not just this process we can understand, not just in terms of Africans in the Ottoman Empire, but also as well as Circassians, as Kurdish populations as well, Armenian populations as well. What does that look like? And so yeah, I want to respond to this fully, but in my research, essentially, I think about, I see how division of labor works as an organizing structure for racialization within a 19th century context, and then how the outcomes of that are present and ubiquitous and very, very ascertainable in a modern day context as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Razan.
Thank you so much for the question about, this question of gender at Al-Azhar and how we can understand it in terms of Blackness. There was a quote I heard earlier this year, and unfortunately I can't remember who made it, but someone said that to speak about race is always to speak about gender and sexuality, because there can be no control over race without control over reproduction. And I think that very much holds true for understanding Blackness, both specifically at Al-Azhar and broadly in Egypt. I think that maybe a missed step of talking about what it means to be Black in the Middle East is to talk about what gender politics looked like during this time period and how they changed during this time period. My own research actually began by looking at marriage texts, legal texts. So like fiqh text is what I was looking at. And I was looking at their sections on marriage, because I was, I wouldn't say surprised, but I was surprised at how these texts were full of language about Blackness and whiteness that I had not seen previous writers address, despite how much scholarship there is about gender and gendered legal reform in the 19th and 20th centuries. I'd never seen someone comment on how much discussion there was of Blackness in these texts, specifically in Egypt. And I began to be interested not only in using these texts as ways of understanding what did elite Azharis, elite men in Egypt think of Blackness and whiteness at the time, and what does that let us know about Blackness in Egypt. But also I began to be interested in how Black Azharis were responding to these texts, or maybe living with them, because these were texts that were very directly jabbing at men who could be construed as themselves. When you are opening up these marriage texts and they say that, for example, you can appeal to laws which characterize marriage as a type of relation which is meant to safeguard the honor of a family, and you can appeal to that to say that you, as a woman who could be married off by your father, will not actually marry a Black man because that's shameful for you. When you read something like that, what I'm looking for is what happened when Black Azharis read something like this, and I'm interested in that because I've seen people who I've known who are Black and at Azhar today negotiating that theologically, having discussions about what does it mean to engage with religious texts that have very heavily racialized and gendered content about Black women and about Black men. And so I think that I saw someone in the question and answers, which we'll be getting to later, ask me why I'm looking at men and whether I'm looking at women. And I think part of it is that I'm focusing more on men than I am on women, partly because Al-Azhar is a very gendered institution at this time period, where those who could travel long distances and openly be writing it in the courtyards of Al-Azhar were those who were gendered as men. But at the same time, what I'm also trying to do with my research is to question this visibility of maleness and to talk about maleness as gender, which I think often does not happen. When you read a book about gender in the Middle East, it's usually about women in the Middle East, right? And I think that shifting that and saying, what's going on? Where are the Black women in these pictures? What are these Black men thinking of the Black women within their lives, and or of just Black non-men in their lives? It's been crucial for me about understanding Blackness in Egypt. And I think that one of the reasons why having a discussion of Blackness that is intertwined with a discussion of gender is so crucial is I think, for example, we can come to much more productive comparative racial studies through doing this, right? We can start to think about what did gendered control of race and Blackness look like in Latin America versus what it looked like in parts of the US, for example, and do those do different forms of control over women's bodies result in different attitudes towards what colorist scales look like in different societies by comparing, for example, Latin America or parts of Latin America with parts of the Middle East and North Africa. So those are the thoughts that have been revolving around my head when it comes to these questions of gender and sexuality. So thanks so much for asking.
Thank you, Razan.
It's Nadje. It's such an interesting question. In Tell This in My Memory, you know, I was very struck by those moments of compared suffering, sometimes between those who were owners or the daughters of slave owners versus actual slaves themselves, and you know, the relationship of Hoda Sharawi's mother to the Saida who governed, you know, Hoda and her brother's childhoods, and how her mom always understood where he came from, and sort of had to kind of translate his authority to the children who thought he was too strict with them, because she felt she understood what it meant to be uprooted from your childhood. And one of the, I don't know if we could call it a conclusion, but one of the things that remains left unanswered is whether or not Hoda Sharawi's mother was herself enslaved. She was certainly a concubine and probably bought. And so I always found sort of her tenderness towards Saida to be, and his to her. You know, these are memoirs, of course, but the fact that Hoda Sharawi remembered that frequently in the memoirs, to me, is very interesting. And then also, I would say in the work that I'm doing now, and this is a continuation in many ways of Saida, is where do eunuchs fit into the gender spectrum? Their very lack of reproducibility or reproductivity was what was done to their bodies, and yet where do their bodies fit into? Did it permanently, in some places, infantilize them? It certainly made them medical oddities in the late 19th century. And how do they fit into this? You know, because we need to talk more about them as well, you know, and I think that Razan is right when she says when we talk about gender, we're often, you know, talking about women, but there was a wide spectrum of not only labor, as Bam was saying, but of a performative type of or lack of reproductivity put in the space of guarding female reproductivity and racial identity. You know, you couldn't have miscegenation because not with these guys, you know. So that's where I would say, and I would end on the gender question with Saint Bachita, who was in my previous book, Until It's in My Memory, and her constant efforts to desexualize herself, how important the nun's habit was for her to completely divorce her image, whether in Sudan or in Italy, or throughout Catholic communities, from ideas of Black women being over-sexualized. And she had been subject to all kinds of sexual abuse and violence. So I just thought it very interesting to go back at that time in that book to see how people explored this for themselves and where links were made that we might not have expected.
Thank you so much. If I could just make one comment before we turn to the discussion, which is that I think another kind of body of work that's really in conversation with these questions is also queer studies and sexuality studies, which I do want to say there has been really good work on critical masculinities in Middle East studies that have kind of changed how we think about the body, and you know, and I think it's still in process, and definitely we need more, but I do think there is a kind of already a body of stuff to build on, and specifically also around, I think, you know, questions of sexuality as well, and intimacy and domestic labor and enslavement and those kinds of really rich work that's been happening. So we have questions in the discussion in the Q&A. It's about 11:37. Do the panelists feel okay with me reading out some of those, and then you all can pick what you'd like to respond to? Does that feel okay for everybody? Okay, so the first question that we had has to do with the Saudi Arabian government's recent abolishment of the kafala sponsorship system. And this person is asking, could we look at this as a first step to abolishing kafala in the region more broadly, or should we be looking at this more carefully as a reform of this oppressive system that is not a dismantlement? We have another question which speaks to a lot of what Razan was talking about in terms of comparative racial, I think comparative race studies is how you put it, in terms of how do we think about the resonance between the difficulties of obscuring and not seeing race in the Middle East with the notion of racial democracy in Brazil, the formulations of mestizaje in some parts of South Latin America. And this person is also thinking through how racialized words enter into some African languages, supposedly shedding their pejorativeness. We have a wonderful but quite broad question that asks, how do we think about race's intersection with nationality, sect, tribalism, which I think in part our wonderful panelists have already begun answering. Oh, much more coming in. So let's stop there, and then we can do another another kind of set of questions. So I'll just open it up. Whoever would like to speak of the panelists, Danny, please go ahead, Razan. Sure,
I'll just respond to this very first question that I'm seeing, which is about Saudis and the kafala system. I think that these reports of Saudi planning to abolish the kafala system are a little bit overblown and too fast for my own liking. I think they came out about 2 days ago. I would have a lot of questions about what Saudi women's rights activists are saying about this. From what I'm seeing of, for example, Chadian women activists who are specifically an ethnicity that often goes to work in Saudi Arabia, they're like, that's not what is going on with this abolition. I just have a lot of questions about what's going on within Saudi right now. I don't think I necessarily have answers, but I wouldn't jump so far as to immediately see that that reform is actually going to happen. I think even if it did, even if tomorrow we woke up and this entire kafala system was abolished, the kafala system operates within a larger spectrum of how the modern Saudi state is racialized, especially in its citizenship system, and how people are able to enter and stay and leave, and who is allowed to enter and stay and leave, which is very tied not only to, you know, the arguments that we can make about the emergence of the modern nation state and the citizenship itself as like a racialized subject, but also very tied to ideas of nasab in Saudi Arabia and who is able to pass down their citizenship and who is not able to based on their gender. So I think the kafala system in Saudi is just I don't want to say it's a tip of the iceberg, but it's tied up, I think, in much broader issues within the kingdom that are only, we'll have to wait and see which activists address them in the upcoming decades. And I'm interested to see what happens.
Thank you for that amazing answer.
Yeah, if that's okay, I'm gonna.
Go ahead, please.
Okay, I'm gonna say, I'm gonna actually take a little bit of what was on just the word abolishment, actually, and just what the question was asking as well, just to think that in reference to this question about the way racialization specifically in Brazil operates is like not seeing race and racialization. I think that what I find really critical about right now is that the question of abolishment is really present in the popular milieu and in our cultural context. And so there's much and I think what the first question shows us is that what abolishment means in one context means something different in another context, which I think is really important to hold. However, I think that there's an intellectual and epistemic turn that I'm noticing in a younger generation, like younger, like undergraduates who are interested in thinking about identity divorced from nation state context or outside of this specificity of nation state context. So how, for example, within Latinx studies, I have seen a turn towards thinking about racialization outside of and specifically thinking about the emergence of the state of Guatemala, for example, or Brazil, or specifically Argentina, and thinking more about how do these forms of identity emerge relative to a state, maybe perhaps not so much about this particular state, but how are they operating in relationship to a state. And I think that that's actually a really interesting turn that's being made currently in thinking about identity, which is also what queer theory is also doing as well, trying to think about identity as not so much only tied to a nation state, but that there are processes that are reproducing or that are homed in on, no matter what nation state context we go to, that are really central to the formation of identity. And so I think that's really what the second question I'm attempting to answer to as well here right now is saying, or getting at essentially, which is what we're also saying, which is that these notions of race and racialization, or not seeing, this imperative to not see, or how to see, these are all questions that emerge in so many divergent nation state context that it almost makes a rule about how to converge about thinking about race and racialization globally as well, which is what I think, which is the most fruitful possibility, I will say.
So powerful. Thank you, Eve.
Just two things. It's so interesting to put race and nationalism in dialogue across the globe. And I'm teaching a seminar right now. Razan is in it. And it's a really extraordinary group of people in this. And we're putting into dialogue questions of race in the Middle East and questions of race in the Caribbean, in France, in Africa, mostly Senegal. And well, it's just putting these together and see what we get and how things, and I think that can be a really effective way of interrogating many of these meetings. And I had nothing on Brazil on the syllabus, to my great shame, but it's been coming up again and again and again because of the students' interest in it. And so I just want to say it's hard, and I'm trying exploring it. And I had another point and it went completely out of my head. Oh, I know. It came back. It came back. One of the ways I'm trying to study this is through blackface and blackface performance across the world. And this is a new course I'll be teaching in the spring. It's an undergraduate seminar, and it was inspired by the spring of 2020 when there were so many different things coming out. And Sherene, you and I were on several things about this, about blackface, the actual performance of blackface. And where I'm going with that is that blackface is not only an investment in different places and in different geographies of a performance of blackness that is known to be fictional. You know, I mean, the fiction is part of the humor, but it's also about whiteness, and it's very much about, you know, how do different societies who have used and laughed at blackface performance, because it's not usually in dramas, what does that mean in terms of investment of these societies or these performers in whiteness? And you know, you can see it in the work of Bita Bahorizadeh as she explores some blackface and whiteface performance in Iran. You can see it certainly in Egypt, and the comedy of Shema Assaif this spring. You know, you can see it it's very interesting looking at films, generations of different films about Antar wa Abla, and sort of how the filmmakers make different interpretations of whiteness. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much. We have about 13 minutes. I'm conscious that folks have places to go and, well, other screens to go to, perhaps is the most accurate. But let me just quickly summarize the 3 questions that are in the Q&A, and then folks can decide what they'd like to respond to. We have one question that's thinking through, you know, how do we understand anti-Blackness in conversation with racialization and oppressive labor structures, South Asians and Southeast Asians in the Arabian Peninsula, all throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, Sri Lankans, Filipinas, etc. And then there's 2 questions that are more about academic life and structure. And one is asking about how racialization has structured access to the Middle East studies as a labor market, reflecting on the ways in which, particularly in Europe, most scholars of the Middle East are white Europeans, and suggesting that perhaps this is different in the United States. And then finally, a question that asks, how does the recent turn in using race as a method in Middle Eastern studies, bolstered in response to North American racial polarization? And then this person asks, how how will perhaps the North American academics' projection of this method conceal more culturally rooted and organic terms of engagement, such as ethnicity in Iran? So I will hand it over to our panelists for your last words, at least on this Zoom session.
So yeah, so many things. I will say first, that I also I want to emphasize as well that while what I think is really interesting about the intellectual tradition of race and racism in the context of the United States is not just the ways that the intellectuals in the United States, Americanists in the United States, and that is both North and South America, as well as the United States, are thinking about racism as it also relates to indigeneity as well, which I think is an interesting framework as to think about in the context of a space like the Middle East, where the question of whiteness, where the question of here-ness, the question of these, they look different, and they kind of challenge what has been taken it for granted as a given with regards to the making of a white thing, or the making of whiteness and what that looks like. And I want to say that. And I also say that there's so many questions that were offered. I really, there's so many interesting points, and I will say that it's really hard as someone who is working on Blackness and race and racialization in the Middle East. It's really hard to say, like, to speak about the way that the commodification of research and how Blackness is really cool right now and interesting to think about and talk about. And so it's really hard to just say that it's not relevant, that there's like a certain kind of commodification of this kind of work. I mean, it's so obvious. It's part of being an academic, I think, and as someone who's trying to, I think those are questions that you ask your whole time as in your careers and as an academic. What do I do about how there's a lot of demand for this kind of research, and there's perhaps a certain form of tokenization that also occurs. I mean, that's just what happens. And there were just, I will say that I think it's just, I find it myself really, really resistant to, I know this is like wild, but it might be wild, but I find it really, really frustrating to constantly think about racism. And maybe that's just full disclosure. I find it very annoying that the question is like race or racism, but it's so important to think about what can't be seen. I mean, that's just what happens and why it's so frustrating, because these things that can't be seen can't be named. And then if we can't name them, there's no attendance to them, attention to them. So I find race as a method to have been really useful, just in terms of being able to make visible what has been invisible.
Thank you. Razan, would you like to weigh in?
Could you rephrase some of this? You had a really nice rephrasing of this, Professor Sherene, and I'm still trying to think about this last question that we got that was about how does race structure, let me try and find it.
About the labor market, or?
Yes, about the labor market in Middle Eastern studies. I mean, I'm not sure that there is a lot to say there. Yes, this is, I mean, we're working within the confines of an academy in the US that was until very recently segregated and not a place for women to enter either. And I think that those structures are still very visible within who is able to enter Middle East studies and how their scholarship is read, and who is read as objective and who is questioned as unobjective when they enter there. I think in particular, almost any Black person I know who is in Middle Eastern studies would immediately say that they have constantly been questioned over whether their scholarship is real or whether they are projecting, as opposed to many of their white European colleagues whose work is considered groundbreaking or really interesting or often objective in ways that I don't necessarily see happening with others. And I think also, aside from older politics of like, oh, how these institutions have been structured, I think the contemporary politics of academia are still ones that are heavily colorist, and that shows in who's able to speak, are still, we can go on the list of all the ways in which academia has all these exclusive structures that keep people out. But I think it's also important for us to remember that academics are not the only people talking about Blackness in the Mideast in particular. I think that there's a tendency sometimes, to search for, not just Blackness in the Middle East, but I think there's a tendency for us to uplift academic spaces as the ones that should be looked to, or the ones that we have to fix so that the information that we get is better. And I think instead what we should also be is, instead of just focusing on reforming these spaces, we should also be thinking about, why are we turning to academic spaces to learn about certain issues? And what are we losing when we only look to academic spaces? So yes, it's a racialized space. And I'll just have to leave it at that.
Eve, would you like to weigh in?
I really appreciate your diplomacy, Sherene, your diplomacy, Razan, and your diplomacy, Bam, in answering that question and in phrasing that question. And I would like to say, plus ça change, plus ça reste le même. Things are changing, but the same questions that are being asked of some of the graduate students with whom I work about their viability in the market are the very same questions that were asked about my work and my position on the job market, when I first went on the market in 1995. And it was assumed among many in my cohort that the only reason I got any job was because I was talking about Black things and then I was Black. And I wish we could say that that's gone out of the way. And I fear it's not actually I fear we're going to get a big blowback, because the academic job market right now is severely limited because of COVID and because of the effect of COVID on universities who haven't been too forward thinking about, their admissions into these programs, in the first place. When I was an associate dean of grad education, I worked with a lot of departments who were like, well, if you haven't studied Greek and Latin in high school, there's no way you can come into graduate school, without thinking of the creativity that people have in trying to find ways towards a goal, or making some kind of structural changes. And finally, I just want to very much echo what Razan is saying about the power of, I think, artists and writers and musicians to lead us in this discussion. And because then you find it's not so hidden. A lot of the tropes that we have been talking about are very, very prevalent in art in the Middle East, period. And so it really is, turn your eyes over, lift your head a little bit more to the side, to recenter how we identify, these discussions of Blackness in the Middle East.
Thank you so much. If you guys will give me 2 minutes, I would just want to say quickly that I think it's really important not to be presentist about how people have been studying race. This did not start this year. People have been doing it for a long time, even in the Middle East, right? So I think that the idea that, oh, we're just projecting a North American kind of category and, oh, in a few years it's going to be looked on in this way is needs to really look more closely at the work. At the same time that I think Bam's point about commodification and tokenism is a really crucial one. Let me just give you a sense of some of the questions that have been in the discussion, because I want to make sure to see those and recognize those. There's an important question about Blackface as genre, which I think is really interesting. There's also an important question about that now disappeared from Mezna about linking Azhar, Razan's work to the studies of enslavement, and to then think about reparations and abolition, which I think is what, BAM was inviting us to think about, the broader movements of abolition that people are engaged in, that are really crucial, and might be contrasted to this language of abolishment, right? The project, the social project of abolition. There's a question also on Zionism, race in Palestine, and there's no one here that would be interested in that. But perhaps we do another webinar on those questions. And then, of course, much gratitude to all your brilliance, both from the audience and for me personally. This was a really inspiring session. Thank you so much, and I'll hand it to Nadje.
Well, thank you so much, Sherene, also for wrapping up with these important words. I just also want to say that clearly we've just scratched on the surface. I mean, only where the history and the historiography is concerned, and there's so much more to talk about. I guess one of the things that gives me hope is that we look at the political struggles in the Middle East right now. I think in as much as gender and sexuality have become much more central to these struggles, I also feel that struggles against racism and the recognition that we really need to expand our idea what Arab means, or Iranian, or Turkish, and of course also recognizing, that there are religious ethnic minorities that do not fit these categories, have been much more sort of central to the wider struggles against authoritarianism. So I feel that's kind of a source of hope. But I really would like to thank you all. I would like to thank Eve, Bam, Razan, of course, Sherene and Beshara for super interesting discussion. It has opened up lots of spaces to explore further. I'd also like to thank Barbara Oberkötter. Clearly, we are committed to continue this, and as some of you know, the Center for Middle East Studies is also really interested to redress, and we had a bit of a disaster here in terms of a conference that was focusing on North Africa without any representation from North Africa, and we are committed to do better and try to address these issues and think more carefully. Well, not only what does anti-Black racism mean in our scholarship, what has it meant sort of historically, but also, how can we, in terms of institutionalizing and in terms of relations, what can we do better? So I hope that I'll see many of you again. This event will be recorded and made available. So thank you all, and thank you, the audience, for joining and asking the questions.